The doorway had been sealed from the outside, not by an earthquake, not by a collapsed roof. Someone had deliberately built a wall across the entrance. It was one house among many in the abandoned desert settlement of Shivta. But archaeologists would eventually discover that this was not an isolated doorway. Across the ruins, more entrances had been blocked, some with carefully placed stones, others with large stone slabs. The city had not simply been abandoned. Someone had closed parts of it behind them. Shivta lies in the Negev Desert, in southern Israel, where the landscape appears almost hostile to permanent settlement. Rain is scarce. The ground is dry. Summer heat can become brutal, and natural water sources are limited. Yet more than 1,500 years ago, people built a thriving settlement here. They constructed houses from stone. They built churches. They created reservoirs. They engineered fields. And they developed ways of collecting and controlling the water that fell during rare desert storms. Shivta was not a forgotten village struggling at the edge of civilization. For centuries, it was part of a sophisticated network of settlements that transformed sections of the Negev into productive agricultural territory. The people who lived there understood something that every desert community must understand. Water could not be taken for granted. A single storm could determine whether a field produced a harvest. A damaged reservoir could threaten an entire community. Every channel, terrace, cistern, and stone-built dam mattered. The settlement itself became an enormous machine for turning rare rainfall into survival. And it worked. For generations, families lived behind those stone walls. Children grew up there. Farmers worked the surrounding fields. Merchants and travelers moved through the region. Religious life developed around large churches. Houses were expanded and rebuilt. The city changed as generations passed. Then, slowly, something began to break. There was no single moment when Shivta disappeared. No great battle has been identified as the final cause. No enormous layer of ash covers the entire settlement. Instead, archaeologists see something much quieter. People began to leave. One house became empty, then another. Some areas continued to function, while other parts of the town were already declining. Buildings were abandoned at different times. Some were reused. Some eventually collapsed. And some had their entrances deliberately sealed. That last detail is where the mystery becomes difficult to explain. Archaeologists documented 21 sealed door openings in 16 residential structures at Shivta. The entrances were not all closed in the same way. Some were blocked with stonework. Some used large slabs. Others were filled with smaller stones, similar to the material used in the surrounding walls. These were not simply doorways buried beneath natural debris. They had been intentionally closed. But by whom? And why? The first possibility is the simplest. Perhaps people were simply protecting abandoned houses. An empty building can become a shelter for animals. Wind can carry sand and debris inside. Valuable objects may have been left behind. A doorway can also become structurally vulnerable once a building is no longer maintained. Sealing it could have been practical, but practical explanations do not answer every question. The sealed entrances were not distributed randomly. Their location suggests that some buildings, streets, or residential compounds may have been abandoned as groups. That changes the picture. A single family leaving its home is one thing. Several connected households leaving an area is something else. It suggests a community undergoing a larger transformation. To understand that transformation, we need to go back to the period when Shivta was alive. The city flourished particularly during the Byzantine period, when the Negev was home to a network of settlements supported by agriculture, trade, and carefully engineered water systems. At first glance, this seems almost impossible. The desert should not have supported a large permanent population. But the inhabitants did not attempt to defeat the desert. They learned how to exploit its rare rainfall. When rainstorms arrived, water flowed rapidly across the landscape. Instead of allowing it to disappear into the ground or run away, people built systems to capture it. Stone walls slowed the flow. Channels directed water. Terraces reduced erosion. Reservoirs stored precious supplies. Fields were positioned where runoff could be collected. It was a delicate balance. The city existed because thousands of small decisions kept that balance working. And this is where the story becomes darker. A system that depends on cooperation can be extremely powerful, but it can also be extremely fragile. If rainfall patterns change, the fields suffer. If agricultural production falls, food becomes more expensive. If trade routes shift, merchants go elsewhere. If political conditions change, communities on the edge of the desert can lose their importance. If people begin leaving, the entire water system becomes harder to maintain. A reservoir does not repair itself. A terrace does not rebuild itself. A field does not remain productive without labor. Once enough people leave, the infrastructure that once made settlement possible begins to fail. This creates a dangerous cycle. Less people means less labor. Less labor means weaker agriculture. Weaker agriculture means fewer reasons for people to remain. More people leave, and the cycle accelerates. This may have been part of what happened at Shivta, but there is another possibility. The environment itself may have changed. Researchers studying the Negev have long examined whether climatic changes contributed to the decline of Byzantine settlements in the region. Periods of reduced rainfall could have placed enormous pressure on communities that depended on carefully managed water. Yet climate alone cannot explain everything. The people of the Negev had survived difficult environmental conditions for centuries. Their entire civilization in the desert was built around adaptation. A bad period of rainfall could hurt them. But a single drought does not automatically explain why an entire settlement would decline. Something else must have been happening at the same time. Perhaps the economy was changing. Perhaps long-distance trade was shifting. Perhaps political control was changing after the transition from Byzantine to early Islamic rule. Perhaps agricultural systems were becoming less profitable. Perhaps several of these forces acted together. At Shivta, the archaeological evidence suggests that abandonment was gradual. Different parts of Shivta appear to have experienced different fates. Some houses remained occupied after others had already been abandoned. Some buildings were reused. Some public areas continued to matter. A child could walk through a street where one house was full of people, while the building next door stood empty. A family could continue using a reservoir, while an abandoned courtyard slowly filled with dust. The churches could remain important even while residential areas were shrinking. The city was not dead yet. It was dying. And then there were the doors. One by one, entrances were closed. A family might have gathered its possessions. A final fire may have burned inside the hearth. The last meal may have been prepared. Someone may have walked through the rooms one final time. Then the doorway was blocked. The people were gone, but the building remained. The moment that doorway is blocked, that relationship is broken. The house becomes isolated, and once the people disappear, the sealed entrance becomes a kind of historical fingerprint. It tells us that somebody was there. Somebody made a decision. Where did the people of Shivta go? Did they move to larger settlements? Did they relocate closer to better agricultural land? Did they follow changing trade routes? Did they move toward towns that offered greater economic opportunities? Or did the population gradually decline through migration, changing family structures, and other pressures? The archaeological evidence does not give us a single destination. There was no mass grave containing the population, no enormous battlefield, no final catastrophe capable of explaining every abandoned building. Centuries later, the settlement would look almost frozen. Stone walls stood against the desert. Churches remained recognizable. Reservoirs preserved the outline of an ancient water system. The city had become a shell. Shivta's sealed doorways offer archaeologists a simple but powerful clue. Someone carried the stones, someone placed them, and someone decided that the house no longer needed to be opened. Perhaps families were leaving. Perhaps the doors were sealed to protect abandoned homes. Archaeology cannot tell us the exact reason in every case. And maybe that uncertainty is what makes Shivta so fascinating. There was no great battle, no mass grave, no single catastrophe. Cities rarely disappear in one dramatic moment. Trade routes change. Agriculture becomes less profitable. Water systems become harder to maintain. Political conditions shift, and slowly, staying becomes harder than leaving. Perhaps that is what happened at Shivta. The city depended on a delicate balance of water, agriculture, trade, and community. When that balance weakened, the houses began to empty. The fires went cold. The fields became silent. The streets lost their people. But the stone walls remained. The churches remained. The reservoirs remained. And the sealed doors remained. They became physical evidence of a decision no one recorded. People left. They closed their homes. And the desert remembered.